Hello and welcome to your last memory revision session. Today we're going to be looking at some of the key studies in the topic of memory. We're going to look through most of them, but we're not going to get a chance to look at eyewitness testimony anxiety, so I've attached a video of that in case you want to revise that as well. So grab your year 1 textbooks because that will help you for this lesson. So firstly, what I want you to do, try and do it without looking in your textbooks, is to match up the key studies for short-term and long-term memory to what they investigated. So pause me now and try and write the answers down for this. So firstly we have Jacobs, and he investigated the capacity of short-term memory, and he did this using the digit span test. So this is what all research on the capacity of short-term memory was based on. So then Miller came along and he came up with the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. And then we have Peterson and Peterson, who tested the duration of short-term memory. They did this by giving consonant and a number and asking participants to remember those consonants whilst counting down, and they found the duration of short-term memory to be about 18 to 30 seconds. Then we have Barrick et al., who did the duration of long-term memory, and they did this using yearbook photos, and obviously they found that those who had graduated within 15 years remembered a lot more than those who had graduated within 45 years. And then we have Badley, who looked at coding. So he found that some short-term memory was encoded acoustically and long-term memory was encoded semantically. Now we're going to go on to look at some studies from interference, which is our first explanation of forgetting. So just as a little reminder, proactive interference is when past learning interferes with new learning, and retroactive interference is when recent memories interfere with old learning. So have a look at these scenarios and decide whether they are proactive or retroactive. First one, Joseph is experiencing retroactive interference because his new mobile number is preventing him from remembering his old mobile number. Michelle is experiencing proactive because her old knowledge of Spanish is interfering with her ability to recall the French word for hello. Ruth is experiencing retroactive because her new PIN number is interfering with her memory for her old PIN number. And David is experiencing retroactive as well because David's new memory of driving an automatic is interfering with his old memory of driving a manual. We're going to do a little test now, and it's very, very similar to what Underwood and Postman did to test retroactive and proactive interference. So I'm going to give you 20 seconds to memorise all of these words. So there's 10 words, and I'll count you down, and I want you to start memorising them now. Okay, so don't write them down, and again I'm going to give you 20 seconds to try and memorise these ones. Your time starts now. Okay, so without cheating, obviously, I want you to try and list as many words you can from list B, so the first slide that you saw, and as many as you can from list C. So pause me now and try and name as many as you can remember. These are all the words that you should have remembered, probably didn't remember them all, But what I want you to ask yourself is, which list did you forget more words on? If you forgot more words from list B, you experienced retroactive interference because your recent learning of list C words interfered with your B words. And if you forgot more from list C, then you experienced proactive interference because your previous learning from list B interfered with your new learning of list C. And this is exactly what Underwood and Postman did to test retroactive and proactive interference. There's more research on retroactive and proactive interference. The first one we're going to look at is Muller and Pilzecker, who tested retroactive. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview and hopefully you'll remember it as I talk to you about it. Muller and Pilzecker gave participants a list of nonsense syllables, so words, so basically words that looked like words but weren't words, and they had to learn them for 6 minutes. After a retention interval, they asked participants to recall the list, and performance was worse if participants were given an intervening task. So in between learning the words and having to recall the words, they were shown 3 landscape paintings and then asked to describe them. And if they were given this task, not all participants were given the intervening task, but if they were given the intervening task, then their recall was worse. So why is this an example of retroactive interference? Pause me now and have a think about that, and try and write a sentence down to explain why it's an example of retroactive interference. It's because the new task of describing the paintings interfered with what had previously been learned. So recent information interfering with old information. And proactive interference was investigated again by Underwood, without the Postman this time. So he analysed findings from a number of studies. During learning a series of word lists, the ones learnt later on are less well remembered than the ones learnt earlier on. So previous information is interfering with new information. Participants who learnt more than 10 lists after 24 hours had a 20% recall, whereas those who only learnt one list had a 70% recall because proactive interference wasn't occurring there. So how is this an example of proactive interference? Again, pause me and try and write a sentence to explain. Each previously learnt word list interferes with the learning of subsequent word lists. And you can see on this diagram that as the number of previous lists increases, the recall decreases. So you can see this negative correlation. So those who only learnt one list had a much better recall than those who learnt 20 lists. And then we also looked at, when we looked at interference, the similarity of test materials. And you don't have to remember the names of McGough and MacDonald, but you do need to remember what they investigated. So they wanted to find out whether interference will be worse if items are similar or dissimilar. So this is what they did. All participants had to learn a list of 10 adjectives, so describing words, and then they had to learn either a list of 10 synonyms, so 10 words that meant the same thing as those adjectives, or they had to learn nonsense syllables, or they had to learn numbers. So have a look at the percentages and write me a sentence about what this suggests about interference and similarity of test materials. It's basically showing that the more similar items are, the less recall. So if words are very similar, we'll forget more than if the two items are completely unrelated, like numbers. The last study we looked at for interference was the real world study by Badley and Hitch, the makers of the working memory model. and they tested interference on rugby players. What the rugby players had to do was to name the teams that they had played against over a rugby season. Now, not all players had played the same amount of games because some were out due to injury. So they wanted to test whether players forgot the names of the teams due to decay, so they just forgot over time, or whether it was interference. So it was either the recent games interfering with the old games or the old games interfering with the new games. And what they found is that players who played the most games forgot proportionately more, which means they worked out a percentage. So they took all the games that they'd played and then worked out the percentage of how many they remembered. So it was in proportion. And they found that it was interference rather than decay, because if it was decay, as an explanation of why they had forgotten, then all players would have forgotten about the same, because the time interval from start to the end of the season was the same for all players. But some had played more games, which meant the intervening teams were different. Then we looked at retrieval failure and this encoding specificity principle, which was proposed by Tulving and Perlston. And encoding specificity principle is all to do with retrieval cues, and they tested to see whether those who had cues presented to them remembered more than those who didn't. So they did this by participants having to learn 48 words from 12 different categories like fruit and colours and animals, etc. And they were presented in category and then word. So fruit, apple, animal, panda, colour, red, etc. And there were 2 IVs, so the participants were either in free recall, so they just had to state as much as they could remember, or they were in cued recall, which means that they were given the category name. And as you can imagine, those who were in the cued recall recalled significantly more than those in the free recall. So those who were given the categories recalled 60%, whereas those who weren't given the categories only recalled 40% of the words. This demonstrates that cues have been explicitly or implicitly encoded at the time of learning, and they have a meaningful link to the learning material. And this has some really good practical applications because we can use retrieval cues when revising. Second part of retrieval failure was context dependent forgetting, and hopefully from the pictures you remember the studies. The first one, the exam hall one, was done by Abernethy, and you don't really have to remember their name, but you do have to remember what they found, which was that if students sat the test in the same room where they had learnt the information with the same instructor, they got higher marks. And similarly, Godden and Badley found that those who learnt the words underwater recalled better underwater. Those who learnt the words on land recalled the words better on land. So what do these pieces of research both show in terms of context-dependent forgetting? Pause me now and have a think about that. That the environment acts as a cue to memory in both studies. So if you're ever struggling to remember something, going back to the environment where you learnt that information or where you experienced that thing is bound to aid that recall. And the last bit of retrieval failure, so we've looked at encoding specificity principle, context-dependent forgetting. The last one is state-dependent forgetting. And we looked at 3 studies for this. The first one that we looked at was Goodwin et al., who found that people who had learnt material when they were drunk then recalled that material better when they were drunk again. If they were sober when they learnt the material, then their recall was better when they were sober. Then we looked at Miles and Hardman, who similarly found that when people learn things when they're exercising, their recall for those things that they learnt will be better when exercising again. And then we looked at Dali et al., who found that participants who hid money when they were high on marijuana were less able to recall where the money was when they were not high than when they were high again. So what do these pieces of research show in terms of state-dependent forgetting? They demonstrate that our internal mental or emotional state can act as a cue. So if you're ever asked in an exam, what does it mean by state-dependent forgetting? That's your basic definition of it. It's to do with our internal mental or emotional state at the time of learning, which can act as a cue later on if we're trying to recall that information. Now we move on to eyewitness testimony. And the first section of eyewitness testimony is misleading information. And this topic is broken up into 2 subsections, leading questions and post-event discussion. So firstly, we're going to look at leading questions. What is the key study for this? The picture is a clue. Hopefully you've all just said in your head, Loftus and Palmer. What I want you to do now is pause me and just take about 5 minutes to use your textbook to summarise both the studies, because Loftus and Palmer have 2 studies that we need to know about, into 10 words or less. So have a go at doing that. Okay, study 1. Participants were shown 7 film clips. Then they were asked a questionnaire, which had a critical question. Obviously, participants didn't know it was the critical question. But what Loftus and Palmer did is they changed the verb in each of these critical questions depending on which group the participants were in. So the verb was the ivy. And the verbs were smashed, collided, bumped, hit, contacted. And in that order, basically smashed had the highest speed estimates and contacted had the lowest speed estimates, which shows that leading questions does have an effect on how eyewitnesses recall information. Then study 2, they were brought back after a week and they found that leading questions can alter the information that we remember. So they asked participants, was there any broken glass when the cars smashed, collided, bumped, hit, contacted, again depending on the group the participants were in. In the smash condition, 16 said yes, there was broken glass. There was no broken glass, by the way. Only 7 said yes in the hit condition, and they also had a control condition, and only 6 said that there was broken glass in this one. So again, showing that leading questions do affect eyewitness testimony. Second part of misleading information in eyewitness testimony is post-event discussion. So what I want you to do again is to just really briefly, even just read through this information because it's not very long, just to refresh your memory on Gabbett and also then repeat interviewing. So just to quickly summarise what Gabbett did, they showed participants a different video of the same crime. So each participant was paired up with another participant who had watched a different video. And then they were asked to go and discuss the video before then reporting back. And a significant proportion of participants, 71%, went on to mistakenly recall items that they acquired during the discussion. So it wasn't things that they had seen themselves, but it was things that they'd heard in the discussion with their partner that had altered their memory. And repeat interviewing basically states that interviews, comments and leading questions will alter an individual's memory, especially in cases when children are interviewed, which is what LaRue et al. Found. And the last section, which has studies in it, is eyewitness testimony anxiety. So I've attached onto Teams a video on this that you watched during lockdown last year. So feel free to go on and watch that, or use your textbook to summarise again these key studies. Any questions, let me know, and please upload your notes onto Show My Homework. See you soon.